Parsha Vayera. The word Vayera means appeared, and so our Torah reading begins. Vayera Elav Adonai, and appeared to him the ever-present one, Be'elonei Mamre, at the oaks of Mamre. V'hu Yoshev Petach Ohel Moed, and he, Abraham, was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Mind you, immediately before this paragraph, Abraham had circumcised himself and his son Yishmael. And the rabbis understand that in this moment, God is engaged in Bikur Cholim, in visiting the sick. So it says in the Talmud in Sota 14a, verse 2, Vayisa Einav, and he, Abraham, lifted up his eyes, Vayar, and he looked, V'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav, and there were three men opposite him. Vayar, and he looked, Vayaratz, and he ran likratam to greet them mipetach ha'ohel, from the entrance of his tent. Vayishtachavu arza, and he, Abraham, bowed to the ground. Vayomer, and he said, Adonai, my master, im namatzatechen beinecha, if please I have found favor in your eyes, al natavor me alavdecha, please do not pass from before your servant. Yukachna ma'at mayim, please may I take a little water, v'rachatzu raglechem, in order to bathe your feet, v'hishanu tachat ha'ed, so that you might relax under a tree. And so the rabbis point to attention. If God is appearing to Abraham, why is he, if you will, looking over God's shoulder? Why is Abraham getting up and leaving God in this moment? And the rabbis emphasize first in the Talmud in Shabbat 127a that God would wish to attend to the needs of fellow humans before God would wish to have his own presence be engaged. And Aaron of Karlin, a Hasidic master, would add, quote, when we turn our attention from God to the needs of people, we do God's will. Conversely, God is not pleased when we place such a great focus on God that we ignore needy human beings, unquote. That being the quote of Harold Kushner, quoting Rabbi Aaron of Karlin. And so in this moment, I want to pause. Although we have before us God's presence through the reading of Torah, I want to talk about this moment in which this morning all the news agencies congratulated Vice President Joe Biden and declared that he is the president-elect. This is a moment of celebration for all those who supported Joe Biden, but more, it's an opportunity for us as a nation to reach out to each other, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, and acknowledge that we are not the disunited states of America, but now we breathe out to come together as the United States. And in doing so, I want to first share a few stories about President-elect Biden and our own community. The first is to celebrate with Lauren Kerner. Many of us, of course, adore who know Lauren, but let me tell you about Lauren Kerner. Bat mitzvah in our congregation, a leader in our USY. And when her brother Daniel was dying of a neurological illness, it was Rabbi Adam Greenwald, our USY rabbi at that time, some 12 years ago. And we as a community who came together to support Mark and Joanna Kerner and Lauren and her brother David. And for Lauren, the passing of her brother Daniel was an enormous blow. There was so much love in that family that was given and received from Daniel. And so later, Lauren would go to UCI and then go to Oxford to earn a master's in political science. And I've always stayed in touch with Lauren, and she shared with me that Oxford had encouraged her to stay on to earn a doctorate, but she chose to go work early on for the Biden campaign. And I called her soon after New Hampshire. You may recall, at that point, Vice President Biden had a very poor showing. It was among the second actually, of the early votes. And she shared with me, because it looked like Biden was, he was fifth, I think, in New Hampshire, that it wasn't going to look good for him going forward. And she shared with me why she had committed herself to Vice President Biden over all the other candidates. She said that as she was feeling the enormity of the loss of her beloved brother, she heard Vice President Biden in an interview talk about how he had overcome the loss, tragically, of his wife and daughter in that car accident, that same period between his having been elected as the senator for the first time and taking his role as senator, which he would begin in 1988. And he said that what allowed me to move forward is to find a purpose and to feel God's goodness in enabling me to move forward toward that purpose. And she said she heard that soon after her brother's passing. And that, coming from somebody who had experienced such loss, gave her comfort and gave her a sense that she too could move forward with purpose, that she too could feel that she could unfold, if you will, I add, in God's light. And that's story one, and I pause to feel Lauren's presence and to feel a long marathon that she has been on as part of the campaign from the early days. Second story is that of Rabbi Michael Beals. Now, that's a story that's been in a lot of the papers, but let me first acknowledge Michael Beals. He's a graduate of Tustin High School, and when he finished at Berkeley, I was just beginning as a rabbi here on B Street yet. It was Michael who would spend time with me as he tried to figure out what he wanted to do next. And he decided to go to Jewish Theological Seminary and to become a rabbi. He was a rabbi here in Southern California, Manhattan Beach, for a while, and then, more than 10 years ago, took a job in Wilmington, Delaware as the rabbi. And he had this story that's, again, become well known, and that is that as he was just beginning in Wilmington, he had a Shiva minyan to do for a woman in the community who lived in a high-rise, kind of a not very expensive building, and the only place where they could have the Shiva minyan to honor her was in the basement, which is where the washing machines were. But it was the only open space. And there he was, conducting the Shiva minyan, when Senator Biden walks in to the room by himself. He had not yet met Senator Biden, and he finished his service, and he went over and he introduced himself as the new rabbi in town in Wilmington. And he said, I am honored to share this service with you, but what brings you here today, this evening? What brings you here to honor the woman? And he said, when I first ran for Congress, and I don't remember her name, so I'll say Mrs. Goldberg. Mrs. Goldberg gave me $18. And every year, she has sent me a check for $18. It's more than 30 years have passed, but I felt the need to honor her, and that's why I'm here. And what Rabbi Beal shared is he did not that night even have an aide with him. There were no cameras. There was no one who knew that Senator Biden was in the room. And that, of course, says a lot about his Menschlichkeit, his loyalty, his care. I was speaking last week with Rabbi Wayne Dosick. Many of us know Wayne, who lives in northern San Diego. And he said to me, I too have a Biden story. The same synagogue where Rabbi Beals is now the rabbi, well over 30 years ago, I was the assistant rabbi. And during my time there, I met Biden. Delaware is so small, everybody knows everybody. But I didn't really know him well. But it was a very hard time. My wife died while I was there. And I received a phone call from Senator Biden. And I was surprised. And he said, I've learned of your loss. I too, as you know, have lost my wife at a young age. And I know how painful it is to have such a tragedy. I want to give you my condolences, and I want to give you my private phone number in my Senate office. If you ever have a need for my comfort, here's my number. Please call. Extraordinary story, not a story that Rabbi Dosick has had in the papers. And so this moment is a moment to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden, his wife, Jill, and to congratulate all those who worked for his election, but more, as the United States of America, for us to gather, to look forward together, to heal the enormous divides of this election and of recent years, to move forward collectively, hoping that we together, regardless of party, can recall what underlies the greatness of America. And in that regard, one of my great privileges in my life was serendipitous. And I've shared this from the Bema, but it's on my mind and I will mention it. And that is, I was on an airplane a few years ago when I saw, getting on the plane next to me was Senator John McCain. And I began to speak with him as we were walking up the aisle, but what surprised me is he walked through the business class, kept walking through where my tickets were, the back of the plane, and as it turned out, sat in the aisle, in the back of the plane, near me. And through that flight, I went over to him and said, if you would be willing, I would like to interview you. I've always admired you, and it would be for me a privilege to spend a little time with you. And he moved over to the middle empty seat in coach. I sat next to him. That was February, the year he died. It was a month before he was diagnosed, roughly. And I spent an hour and a half. He said to me, fire away. Anything you want to ask, I'm happy to answer. And in that hour and a half, he had nothing to gain in talking to me. I wasn't a constituent. I told him I was changing planes in Phoenix to go to California. I even told him that I'm a rabbi and that I vote for the other party. He was so present, so willing to speak about sensitive issues. I asked him about his loss and what he had learned from losing the campaign. And he answered what felt to me, man to man, open. When I finished, and I actually knew he was tired, he had been sleeping before I went over to sit next to him, and again would only learn later that he was indeed the beginning phases of his cancer of the brain. But as I said to him, thank you for this conversation, I was aware of a privilege rare for any person to be able to speak to somebody so openly who had access to so much power, the ability to affect change. And in the last day or two, I've had the opportunity to look at Senator John McCain's concession speech in the first election with President Obama. It's 10 minutes long, and I invite you to watch it. It is the most stirring display of what America is about at its best. It's a concession speech. It's an acknowledgement of having lost an election. But it's a speech about what unites us as a country. Winners and losers, but that aside, what unites us by values that enables us as a nation to come together. And so I honor Senator John McCain in this moment as truly an exemplar, as a Republican leader of what it means to be an American leader in our midst. And now to our Torah reading. V'yare lav Adonai bolonei mamrei. And he, Abraham, lifted his eyes toward God at the tents of Elonei Mamre, as he sat in the opening of his tent in the heat of the day. Vayisa einav v'yar, and he lifted his eyes, and he looked. V'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav, and behold, there were 3 men approaching him. V'yaratz likratam, and he ran to greet them. Mipetach ohel, from the entrance of his tent. V'yishtachavu arza, and he bowed to the ground. V'yomar, and now listen how many times this leader to be of the Jewish people, who is humbling himself before strangers, listen carefully to the words and focus on how many times he will say please and the verbs. V'yomer Adonai, and he said, my masters, imna, if please, mitzati chen be'inecha, I have found favor in your eyes. Al na, please do not, ta'avor me'al avadecha, pass from before your servant. Yukach na, let me take, please, ma'at mayim, just a little water. V'rachatzu raglechem, in order to wash your feet. V'hisha'anu tachat ha'etz, that you should recline under the tree. Ve'ekcha pat lechem, and he took a piece of bread. Ve'sadu libchem achar ta'avoru, that they might refresh themselves. Ki alkein avartem alavadechem, so that you will not pass from before your servant. Ve'yomru, and they answered, Kain ta'aseh, so we will do, kasher dibarta, as you have spoken. And so in these first 5 verses, caring for other people, the rabbis will understand, takes precedence for even a visit from God, because that is to visit with God. These are strangers to Abraham, and yet Abraham becomes, for us, the Jewish people, and his wife Sarah, the exemplars of character. What is his character as displayed? It's first a desire to serve. He rushes in a moment. He promises little, we will see, and does much. And he engages in invitation with humility. He bows before the stranger. He refers to himself as their servant to make their lives better in a small way. A little water, a little bread, a little shade. And now it continues. Vaymaher Avraham, and Abraham rushed, Ahola el Asara, into the tent of Sarah. Vayomer, and he said, Mahari, hurry up. Shalosh sa'im kemach solet, 3 seahs of the choicest flour. Lushi va'asi ugot, knead and make cakes. Velabakar, and to the flock. Ratz Avraham, Abraham ran. Vayikach ben Bakar, and he took one of the flock. Rach, the tov, that was soft, tender, and choice. Vayiten el hana'ar, and he gave to his assistant. Vaymaher la'asot oto, and hastened to prepare it. Vayikach chema v'chalav, and he took curds and milk, uvena bakar, and then the meat, asher asa, which they had made, vayitain lifnehem, and he gave it before them, v'hu omed alehem, and he stood near them, tachat ha'etz v'ya'ochelu, under the tree, as they ate. Abraham didn't do it alone. Abraham did it with his wife, with Sarah. And more, he did it with a servant, with an aide. You see, even in this micro setting of serving strangers, Abraham displays leadership by calling on the resources of his relationships in order to help. And we, in our Jewish tradition, see Abraham and Sarah as a unit. In our mystical tradition, the quality of character with which Abraham and Sarah are identified on the Sfirot, the 10 emanations, is chesed, kindness. His son Yitzchak will be Gevurah, Yaakov will be Tiferet, a harmonization of the two. But in this moment of our Torah reading, in this day, what we're reminded of is that the starting point for God and relationship is the ability to be engaged in giving with expecting nothing in return. Abraham sought nothing from the strangers. Rather, he saw them as the opportunity, as an extension of God's presence. Later in the Torah reading, there will be many dramatic moments that will call on Abraham to rise beyond himself. He will do so on behalf of his nephew Lot and go to war, because sometimes fighting is necessary to help his nephew Lot, who to him is like a son, who's been taken captive in that war, and he will redeem him. He will fight. He will also fight with words, because words are action. And our leaders and how they use words will define them. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Abraham will say to God, will the judge of the earth not act with justice? Words are deeds. And in this stirring account in our parsha, Abraham will argue, debate, negotiate with humility, efer va'afar, acknowledging I am but dust and ashes, God, but yet justice is your calling card and is why you chose me. And yet there's also in this parsha that traumatic event of God, or at least Abraham, hearing, imagining God saying, place your son up on the altar. I heard a Dvar Torah this week by a Chinese student, a senior at Tarbut V'Torah. I say Chinese because her English was clearly learned in recent years. And as her teacher and mentor, Rabbi Stuart Light, introduced her, he in fact presented her Dvar Torah that she had given earlier this week to her fellow students at Tarbut V'Torah. And he outlined what she would say because he knew that her accent would be a challenge for some. And what she spoke about is this moment in Abraham's life in which there is this balance between challenging God on behalf of strangers and not protecting his son when called on to offer him on the altar. And what she said to her classmates was the following: we are called to reach out to others. And so that's what the text teaches with Abraham as the exemplar, to protect even a stranger we do not know, and more, to protect strangers that we have heard act in evil ways. And so, why did Abraham not protect his son? She said, because other rabbis had taught her, because sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves, to take care of our families. It's not a traditional commentary I have heard, which is why I repeat it today. But I found it was a facet and worth repeating. We live in turbulent times. We are reminded that morality equals seeing and responding to the we. Abraham is our teacher and Sarah are our teachers to have an enthusiasm for caring for the stranger, because they too are God's children, and to do so is to act on behalf of God and to balance it with taking care of our families and taking care of ourselves. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, may we pause to breathe out over tense days of vote counting. We are privileged to live in a country where there is a system that is worthy of honoring, in which each of us through vote has voice. May we come together as a nation with hope, with feeling God's presence at the entrance to our tents, and may we rush forward to help each other so that we as the United States of America may go from strength to strength. Amen.